In 1883, Colorado, a town divided by prejudice, faced a moment that would change everything. When a deaf woman in a wedding dress walked down the dirt road, the mockery began. But no one expected what happened when the only black rancher in the county stepped forward. Some called it a miracle, others called it impossible. By the end, a town would never be the same. What you're about to witness isn't just a story of love, but a revelation about what it truly means to hear another person's soul. And why sometimes those who seem most different are the ones who understand us best. Before we continue this extraordinary tale from the untold pages of Western history, make sure you subscribe to the Black Rancher channel right now and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Trust me, what happens in Chapter 3 will leave you speechless. And the ending? Well, I promise it's worth staying until the very last minute. Now, let's ride back to Colorado, 1883, where our story begins. The town of Redemption Creek didn't take kindly to outsiders. Nestled between jagged mountains in the Colorado Territory, it had grown from a mining settlement to a proper town with proper ways and proper prejudices. Isaiah Freeman stood 6 feet tall on the edge of town, his dark skin glistening with sweat after the long ride from his ranch 10 miles north. At 32, his shoulders were broad from years of breaking horses and working cattle. A thin scar ran across his left cheekbone, a reminder of a stallion that nearly took his eye 5 years back. The townspeople called him the Black Rancher, never Isaiah, rarely Freeman, as if his profession and his skin were one and the same. "Morning, Mr. Jenkins." Isaiah tipped his worn leather hat to the general store owner, who merely grunted in acknowledgement. Isaiah tied his horse, a powerful chestnut mare named Whiskey, outside the telegraph office. He needed supplies, but first, he needed information. His cattle buyer in Denver hadn't sent payment for his last drove, and winter was coming. Without that money, he'd lose everything he'd built over the last decade. Inside, the telegraph operator, a thin man named Willard, looked up with surprise. "Freeman wasn't expecting you in town today." "Wasn't planning on coming," Isaiah replied, his deep voice resonating in the small office. "Need to send a wire to Denver." "Anderson hasn't paid for those longhorns I drove up last month." Willard nodded, taking the paper Isaiah handed him. "Town's all stirred up today. You picked an interesting time to visit." Isaiah raised an eyebrow. "How's that?" "New preacher's getting married. Brought his bride all the way from Boston. Fancy education, they say." Willard leaned forward. "And deaf as a post. Can't hear a lick. Uses her hands to talk." Isaiah's expression remained neutral, though his interest was piqued. "Don't see how that's the town's business. Folks are saying no man of God should marry a woman who can't hear the Lord's word," Willard continued, lowering his voice. "Some saying it ain't natural. Pastor Williams from over in Silver Creek refused to perform the ceremony. That's why they're doing it here." Isaiah nodded slowly, understanding all too well how quickly a town could turn on those deemed different. "When's the ceremony?" "This afternoon." Towns divided on whether to attend or protest. Willard began tapping out the telegraph message. "Which side do you figure to be on?" Isaiah placed coins on the counter. "Don't recall being invited to either." Outside, Isaiah noticed the town was indeed more active than usual for a Tuesday. Small groups gathered on street corners, conversations hushing as he walked past. He'd lived near Redemption Creek for 10 years, but remained as much an outsider as the day he arrived. The only reason they tolerated him at all was his skill with horses. Even prejudice took a back seat when someone needed the best horse trainer in the county. At the general store, he gathered his supplies methodically: coffee, flour, ammunition, and a new shirt he'd been saving for. As he approached the counter, he overheard 2 women talking. "They say she reads lips, but how's a woman supposed to be a proper wife if she can't hear when her husband calls?" "It's unnatural," the older woman said, not bothering to lower her voice when Isaiah approached. "Morning, Mrs. Thornton," Isaiah said politely. The women fell silent, eyeing him with suspicion as he paid for his goods. As Isaiah loaded his supplies onto Whiskey, a commotion drew his attention to the far end of Main Street. A stagecoach had arrived, and a small crowd was gathering. Curiosity got the better of him. Leading Whiskey, he walked toward the gathering. The crowd parted slightly at his approach, not out of respect but discomfort. From the stagecoach emerged a young man in a black suit, presumably the new preacher. He was followed by a young woman in a simple blue traveling dress. She was petite, with auburn hair pulled back neatly. Her eyes, a striking green, scanned the crowd with obvious apprehension. The preacher spoke. "Good people of Redemption Creek, I'm Reverend Thomas Bennett. This is my fiancée, Miss Elizabeth Hayward. We're grateful for your hospitality and look forward to serving this community." As he spoke, the young woman watched his lips intently. When he finished, she smiled nervously at the crowd. A few people nodded in greeting, but many simply stared. An older woman stepped forward. How's she expect to be a preacher's wife if she can't hear the word of God? Elizabeth's smile faltered as she read the woman's lips. The preacher stepped forward protectively. "Miss Hayward has a profound understanding of Scripture and God's love that puts many hearing folks to shame, ma'am." Isaiah watched as the young woman touched Thomas's arm and began moving her hands in fluid patterns, sign language. Thomas watched intently, then nodded. "Elizabeth says she's pleased to meet you all and hopes you'll judge her by her actions rather than her limitations." A murmur ran through the crowd. Some faces softened, others hardened. Isaiah turned to leave when he felt eyes on him. Elizabeth was looking directly at him, the only black face in the crowd. There was no judgment in her eyes, only curiosity. She gave him a small smile. Without thinking, Isaiah tipped his hat to her, a gesture of respect he rarely offered in town. Several townspeople noticed, their expressions darkening. As Isaiah mounted whiskey to leave, Sheriff Taylor approached. "Freeman," he said gruffly, "didn't expect to see you in town today." "Just supplies and a telegram, Sheriff. Heading back now." The sheriff lowered his voice. "Might be best if you did. Town's on edge with the new preacher and his unusual bride. Don't need any more complications." Isaiah understood the warning. He was being told to stay away from the wedding, from the town's affairs. He nodded once and turned whiskey toward home. But as he rode out, the image of the young woman's curious, fearless eyes stayed with him. Two outsiders in a town that feared difference. He hadn't planned on attending any wedding, but something told him their paths would cross again. What Isaiah couldn't know was how soon that would be, or that when it happened, it would change both their lives forever. The morning of the wedding arrived with a chill in the air that spoke of early winter. Isaiah hadn't planned to go into town again so soon, but fate had other ideas. His best plow horse, Big John, had thrown a shoe and stepped on a nail. The wound was deep and showing signs of infection. Isaiah needed medicine from the town doctor, or he'd lose the horse, and without Big John, he couldn't prepare his fields for winter wheat. One horse might seem small to some, but for Isaiah it could mean the difference between survival and ruin. He dressed in his cleanest shirt, not his best, which he saved for special occasions, and rode whiskey into Redemption Creek just as the church bells began to ring. The town seemed eerily empty until he realized where everyone had gone. Despite the controversy, it seemed the wedding had drawn a crowd. The doctor's office was locked, a sign on the door. "At church, back at noon." Isaiah checked his pocket watch. It was only 10. The medicine would have to wait. As he turned to leave, a wagon pulled up beside him. Inside sat Harold Walker, one of the few ranchers who treated Isaiah with something approaching respect. "Freeman," Walker called. "Headed to the wedding?" Isaiah shook his head. "Need the doctor. Big John's got a bad hoof." Walker frowned. "Doc won't be back till after the ceremony. You might as well come along." Quite the spectacle brewing. Half the town's there to support, half to gawk. Some mean to cause trouble. Isaiah hesitated. The last place he needed to be was in the middle of town controversy. But if trouble was brewing at a wedding, especially one involving two vulnerable outsiders, perhaps another outsider's presence might help. "I'll wait for the doctor," Isaiah said finally. Walker shrugged. "Suit yourself, though that preacher could probably use a friendly face." Not many willing to stand up for him and that deaf girl. As Walker's wagon pulled away, Isaiah stood in indecision. Then, almost against his better judgment, he turned whiskey toward the church. The small white church at the end of Main Street was packed to overflowing. Isaiah approached slowly, tying whiskey at a distance. He had no intention of entering. Churches in Redemption Creek had made it clear he wasn't welcome inside their hallowed walls, but he could observe from afar. A group of men stood smoking near the entrance, their expressions sour. Isaiah recognized Hank Sullivan, owner of the saloon, and his usual crowd of troublemakers. "Ain't right," Sullivan was saying loudly. "Preacher's wife needs to hear the word of God. It's unnatural otherwise." "Heard she reads them fancy books," another man said. "Probably got all kinds of northern ideas about equality and such." A third man spat on the ground. "First they send us a preacher barely old enough to shave. Then he brings this broken woman to teach our children. What next?" Isaiah kept his distance but watched carefully. The mood was uglier than he'd expected. These weren't just judgmental churchgoers. These were men looking for an excuse. Suddenly, a stagecoach appeared at the far end of the street. It stopped, and the driver helped Elizabeth down. She wore a simple white dress, with lace at the collar, and a small bouquet of wildflowers. Her hair was pinned up with what looked like pearl combs. She looked nervous but determined. An older woman, presumably her traveling companion, walked beside her toward the church. As they approached, the men by the entrance fell silent, but their expressions spoke volumes. Elizabeth must have sensed their hostility because she faltered. The older woman whispered something, and Elizabeth nodded, squaring her shoulders and continuing forward. As they reached the church steps, Sullivan stepped directly in their path. "We don't want your kind here," he said slowly, exaggerating his mouth movements so she could read his lips. Elizabeth's companion bristled. "How dare you? This is a house of God." "Exactly," Sullivan replied, "and she can't even hear the Lord's Prayer. It's mockery to have her as our preacher's wife." Elizabeth touched her companion's arm, calming her. Then, to Isaiah's surprise, she began to sign, her hands moving gracefully. The older woman translated, "She says she may not hear with her ears, but she hears with her heart. And right now, her heart hears only hate in this place where there should be love." Sullivan's face darkened. "Witchcraft talk, using those devil signs." A murmur of agreement rose from his companions. Inside the church, people were beginning to notice the confrontation, heads turning toward the entrance. Isaiah saw the fear flash across Elizabeth's face, quickly replaced by determination. But he also saw Sullivan's hand move slightly toward his belt, where Isaiah knew he carried a knife. Before he could think better of it, Isaiah was moving forward, his long strides carrying him quickly to the church steps. "Miss Hayward," he said, tipping his hat, "congratulations on your wedding day." All eyes turned to him in shock. Sullivan's group, Elizabeth, her companion, and now the people inside the church. For a black man to approach a white woman so directly, to speak to her by name, it was unheard of in Redemption Creek. Elizabeth's eyes widened in recognition from their brief encounter the day before. To everyone's surprise, she smiled and began to sign. Her companion, still flustered, translated. "She says, 'Thank you, sir,' and asks if you'll be attending the ceremony." Sullivan stepped forward. "Now wait just a minute, Freeman. You're not welcome here." Isaiah kept his eyes on Elizabeth. "I believe that's for the bride to decide, seeing as it's her wedding day." The tension was palpable. Sullivan and his men were now caught between their hatred for the deaf bride and their deeper prejudice against Isaiah. The churchgoers had fallen silent, watching the confrontation unfold. Elizabeth, seeming to understand the dangerous currents swirling around her, made a decision. She signed again, her movements deliberate. "She invites you to witness her marriage," the companion translated, her voice gaining strength. "She says anyone who respects others is welcome in God's house today." From inside the church, Reverend Bennett appeared at the doorway, taking in the scene with alarm. "Elizabeth, Mrs. Harper, is everything all right?" Sullivan turned to the young preacher. "This is your doing, bringing her here, bringing him here. This isn't what this town stands for." The Reverend looked nervous but stood his ground. "This town stands for Christian values, Mr. Sullivan. Love, acceptance, charity. At least that's what I was told when I accepted this position." Sullivan spat on the church steps. "Come on, boys. Let them have their blasphemous ceremony, but don't expect us to forget this." He glared at Isaiah. "Any of it." As Sullivan and his men stalked away, a collective breath seemed to release from the gathering. Elizabeth looked at Isaiah with gratitude, then signed something to her companion. "She asks your name, sir," Mrs. Harper translated. "Isaiah Freeman, ma'am. I own the ranch north of town." Elizabeth signed again, her movements graceful despite her obvious nervousness. "She says she's pleased to meet you properly, Mr. Freeman, and thanks you for your kindness. She hopes you'll stay for the ceremony and the small reception after." Isaiah knew he should refuse. Being seen in the church would only inflame tensions further, but the genuine warmth in Elizabeth's expression, so rare in his interactions with the townspeople, made him hesitate. "I'd be honored, Miss Hayward, but perhaps it's best if I observe from the back." As they entered the church, a murmur ran through the congregation. Some looked scandalized, others curious. A few, to Isaiah's surprise, nodded in approval. The ceremony began, with Isaiah standing in the shadows at the very back. He watched as Elizabeth and Thomas exchanged vows, hers in sign language, translated by Mrs. Harper. When the reverend performing the ceremony declared them man and wife, Thomas signed "I love you," before leaning in to kiss his bride. In that moment, watching the tenderness between them, Isaiah felt a pang of something he rarely allowed himself to feel: longing. Not just for companionship, but for acceptance, for someone who would look at him the way Elizabeth looked at Thomas, seeing the man, not the color of his skin. Little did he know that this wedding was just the beginning. The events set in motion that day would soon draw him deeper into the lives of the Bennett family, and into a conflict that would test not just his courage, but the soul of Redemption Creek itself. If you're still with me, you're about to discover why the Black Rancher channel brings you the most compelling stories from the forgotten pages of American history. What happens next changed the course of Redemption Creek forever. Subscribe now if you haven't already, and share this video with someone who appreciates authentic stories of courage and redemption. Now, let's continue with Chapter 3, where everything is about to change. 3 weeks after the wedding, the first heavy snow fell on Redemption Creek. Isaiah had managed to save Big John's hoof, and the plow horse was recovering well, but the early winter meant Isaiah had to work twice as hard to prepare for the cold months ahead. He'd avoided town since the wedding, focusing on his ranch and ignoring the rumors that undoubtedly circulated about his appearance at the church. But as the snow piled up, he found himself running low on essential supplies. On a bitter cold Tuesday, he hitched his wagon and made the journey into town, the wheels crunching through fresh snow. Main Street was quiet, most people huddled indoors against the chill. Isaiah moved quickly, gathering his supplies and avoiding eye contact. As he loaded the last of his goods, a commotion from the direction of the church caught his attention. Raised voices carried on the cold air, angry voices. Against his better judgment, Isaiah secured his wagon and walked toward the sound. A crowd had gathered outside the small building beside the church that served as both schoolhouse and parsonage. At the center of the group stood Thomas Bennett, his face flushed with anger, and opposite him, Hank Sullivan and several town council members. "This is outrageous," Thomas was saying. "You can't do this." "It's already done," replied Mayor Thornton, a portly man who owned the bank. "The town council voted last night. We can't have someone teaching our children who can't even hear them." With a shock, Isaiah realized they were talking about Elizabeth. He edged closer, trying to remain inconspicuous. "My wife is an educated woman," Thomas insisted. "She graduated from the Hartford School for the Deaf with highest honors. She's trained specifically to teach children." "She can teach deaf children somewhere else," Sullivan said coldly. "Our children are normal." "They need normal teachers." Thomas's hands clenched into fists. "She was hired along with me. It was in our contract." "Contracts can be amended," Mayor Thornton said smoothly. "We're not dismissing you, Reverend. Just your wife." Isaiah saw Elizabeth appear in the doorway behind her husband. Her expression made it clear she understood exactly what was happening. She placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder and began to sign. Thomas watched her hands, his expression shifting from anger to reluctant acceptance. He turned back to the council members. "My wife says she understands your concerns. She asks for one opportunity to demonstrate her teaching abilities before you make your final decision." Sullivan scoffed. "What's she going to do?" Teach them all to wave their hands around like lunatics? Something dangerous flashed in Thomas's eyes, but Elizabeth squeezed his shoulder again, her expression resolute. Mayor Thornton cleared his throat. I suppose that's reasonable. One demonstration tomorrow at noon. The council will observe and make their final decision. As the crowd began to disperse, Isaiah caught Elizabeth's eye. She recognized him immediately, and a small smile flickered across her face. She signed something to Thomas, who looked up in surprise. Mr. Freeman, Thomas called, would you wait a moment? Isaiah hesitated, aware of the disapproving glances from departing townspeople. But he nodded and approached the couple as the last onlookers left. Mr. Freeman, my wife wants to thank you again for your kindness at our wedding, Thomas said. We haven't had a chance to properly express our gratitude. Isaiah tipped his hat. No need for thanks, Reverend. Miss Elizabeth deserved a peaceful wedding day. Elizabeth began to sign, her movements more deliberate so Isaiah could appreciate the grace of the language even if he couldn't understand it. Thomas translated. She says she's never forgotten your kindness, and that you were the first person in town to treat her like a whole person instead of a curiosity or a burden. Isaiah nodded respectfully. People fear what they don't understand, Mrs. Bennet. I know something about that. Elizabeth signed again, her expression earnest. She asks if you would consider attending her teaching demonstration tomorrow, Thomas said, looking somewhat surprised by the request himself. She says having someone there who knows what it's like to be judged unfairly would give her strength. Isaiah was taken aback. The request was unprecedented. A white woman, the preacher's wife no less, specifically asking for his presence at a public event. It could only make things harder for her. Are you certain that's wise, Mrs. Bennet? He asked, addressing her directly. My presence might turn some folks even further against you. Elizabeth's response was immediate and emphatic, her hands moving with conviction. She says, Thomas translated, his voice tinged with admiration, that she didn't come to Redemption Creek to make safe choices. She came to make a difference, and she believes you understand that better than anyone. Isaiah looked into Elizabeth's determined green eyes and saw something he recognized, not just courage, but the bone-deep weariness that comes from constantly fighting to be seen as fully human. In that moment, a connection formed between them, a recognition between two souls who knew what it meant to be perpetually judged. Then I'll be there, Mrs. Bennet, Isaiah said simply, though I'll stay at the back. Elizabeth smiled and signed again. She says, Thomas translated with a small smile, that she hopes someday you'll call her Elizabeth, as friends should. That night, as a fresh snow fell on his small ranch house, Isaiah sat by the fire contemplating the strange turn of events. In 10 years, he'd never been invited to any town function. He'd built his life carefully, keeping his distance, speaking only when necessary, avoiding conflict despite the daily indignities. It was how he survived. Yet tomorrow, he would potentially jeopardize everything by publicly supporting the deaf wife of the new preacher. It wasn't wise. It wasn't safe. But as he stared into the flames, Isaiah realized that Elizabeth Bennet had awakened something in him that had been dormant for too long, the desire to stand for something more than mere survival. The next day, precisely at noon, Isaiah slipped into the back of the schoolhouse. The room was crowded with council members, parents, and curious townspeople. At the front, Elizabeth stood confidently beside a chalkboard, dressed in a simple blue dress, her auburn hair neatly pinned. Mayor Thornton cleared his throat. Mrs. Bennet will now demonstrate her teaching methods. The council will then deliberate. Elizabeth nodded and began to write on the chalkboard in elegant script. Today we learn to speak with our hands. She turned and, seeing Isaiah at the back, gave him a small nod of gratitude before addressing the room. She began to sign slowly while Thomas translated. In a world of sound, those without hearing must find other ways to understand and be understood. Today I will show you how the language of signs opens doors that silence has closed. She invited several children to the front, including, to everyone's surprise, Sally Williams, the shy daughter of the town's most prominent businessman. As Elizabeth began teaching the children simple signs, "Hello, thank you, friend," something remarkable happened. The children, initially hesitant, became enthusiastic, their laughter filling the room as they practiced. Even more surprising was Sally Williams. The girl, known for barely speaking above a whisper, was signing with confidence, her face alight with joy at mastering each new word. After 15 minutes, Elizabeth had the children demonstrate what they'd learned. Sally, to her father's visible astonishment, voluntarily stood before the room and signed a complete sentence, which Elizabeth wrote on the board. "My name is Sally. I am happy to meet you." A murmur ran through the adults. Mr. Williams stared at his daughter in wonder. Isaiah had never seen the shy child so animated. Elizabeth then wrote a question on the board. "What is the greatest barrier between people?" She invited answers. After several responses, language, distance, wealth, she wrote her own answer: misunderstanding. She began to sign again, with Thomas translating, "Being deaf has taught me that understanding comes in many forms." Sometimes the people who cannot hear the words find other ways to listen to the heart, and sometimes those who hear perfectly still fail to understand their neighbor. Her gaze swept the room, briefly meeting Isaiah's. "I came to Redemption Creek not despite being deaf, but because of it. I know what it means to be silenced, to be dismissed, to be considered less. And I believe every child should learn not just reading and figures, but how to truly see one another beyond our differences." As Elizabeth continued, Isaiah noticed Mr. Williams leaning toward Mayor Thornton, whispering intently. The mayor's expression shifted from dismissive to thoughtful. By the end of the hour, Elizabeth had taught the entire room basic signs and demonstrated her methods for teaching reading and arithmetic. The children were engaged, the parents impressed, despite themselves. As the demonstration concluded, Mayor Thornton stood. "The council will now deliberate." "If I may, Mayor," Mr. Williams interrupted, rising to his feet. "I've seen enough. My Sally hasn't spoken more than 10 words together in public since her mother died 3 years ago. Today I watched her come alive again." His voice cracked slightly. "I withdraw my objection to Mrs. Bennett's appointment. In fact, I insist that she be retained." A murmur ran through the room. Mr. Williams was the town's wealthiest citizen and the council's most influential member. Sullivan stood, his face dark with anger. "This doesn't change anything. She's still a qualified teacher," Mr. Williams cut in sharply, "and exactly what this town needs." He turned to face the crowd. "Unless anyone wants to explain to me why my daughter shouldn't have the best education available?" The challenge hung in the air. One by one, the council members nodded in agreement, until only Sullivan and 2 others remained opposed. "Then it's settled," Mayor Thornton declared, clearly relieved to have the controversy resolved. "Mrs. Bennett will begin teaching Monday next." As the crowd dispersed, many approached Elizabeth to congratulate her, including several who had opposed her just the day before. Isaiah remained at the back, watching the transformation with a mixture of amazement and caution. These were the same people who had barely acknowledged him for a decade, now suddenly embracing difference in their midst. As the room emptied, Elizabeth spotted Isaiah by the door and made her way to him, Thomas following. "Mr. Freeman," Thomas said, his face alight with joy. "We did it, or rather Elizabeth did it." Elizabeth signed, her movements energetic with excitement. "She says she couldn't have done it without knowing you were here," Thomas translated. "Having a friend in the room made all the difference." Isaiah tipped his hat. "You did that all yourself, Mrs. Bennett. I just watched." Elizabeth signed again, her expression becoming serious. "She says," Thomas translated, "that sometimes being seen is the most powerful gift one person can give another. Today you saw her, and she sees you." The simple truth of her words struck Isaiah deeply. In a town where he'd been deliberately unseen for so long, Elizabeth Bennet truly saw him. Not the black rancher, not the outsider, but Isaiah Freeman, the man. But as they stood there, a shadow fell across the doorway. Hank Sullivan and his friends hadn't left with the others. They blocked the exit, their expressions dangerous. Quite a performance, Sullivan said coldly. Got the town fooled. But this isn't over. Thomas stepped protectively in front of his wife. Mr. Sullivan, I think it's best if you leave now. Sullivan ignored him, his eyes fixed on Isaiah. And you? Should have stayed on your ranch where you belong, Freeman. Didn't your daddy teach you to know your place? Isaiah remained expressionless, though his body tensed. My father taught me to stand with good people, Mr. Sullivan. I'm just following his teaching. Sullivan's hand moved toward his belt. Your kind standing with white women? That's not just wrong, that's dangerous thinking. Isaiah saw the knife before Sullivan fully drew it, but before he could react, Thomas lunged forward, grabbing Sullivan's wrist. The two men struggled, Sullivan's friends moving to join the fight. Isaiah stepped forward to help Thomas, but Elizabeth was faster. She grabbed a heavy brass bell from her desk and with surprising strength brought it down on Sullivan's shoulder. He howled in pain, dropping the knife. The distraction gave Isaiah the moment he needed. He grabbed Sullivan, his powerful arms restraining the smaller man. That's enough. Sullivan's friends hesitated, unwilling to directly confront Isaiah's imposing figure. This isn't over, Sullivan hissed as Isaiah released him. Any of it. As Sullivan and his friends retreated, Thomas turned to Isaiah with newfound respect. Thank you, that could have ended badly. Isaiah nodded grimly. It still might. Sullivan doesn't forget slights, real or imagined, and now he has a new grudge against all three of us. Elizabeth touched Isaiah's arm, drawing his attention. When she was sure he was watching, she signed slowly, clearly trying to show him the meaning. She's saying, friend, Thomas translated, and thank you. Isaiah watched the graceful movement of her hands, then carefully imitated the sign for friend. Elizabeth's face lit up with a brilliant smile, and she nodded enthusiastically. In that moment, standing in the afternoon light of the small schoolhouse, something shifted in Redemption Creek. An unlikely alliance had formed, the black rancher, the young preacher, and the deaf teacher, bound by a common understanding of what it meant to be different in a world determined to enforce sameness. None of them could have predicted how severely that alliance would be tested in the days to come, or how it would forever change not just their lives, but the heart of the town itself. The weeks following Elizabeth's teaching triumph brought an uneasy calm to Redemption Creek. On the surface, life settled into a rhythm. Elizabeth began teaching, quickly becoming beloved by her students. Thomas's congregation grew as people came, initially out of curiosity, then increasingly out of genuine interest in his thoughtful sermons. For Isaiah, life continued much as before, the endless work of maintaining his ranch, the careful distance he kept from town affairs. But subtle changes had begun. When he came to town for supplies, some people now nodded in greeting. Mrs. Williams, grateful for her daughter's transformation, went out of her way to thank him for supporting Elizabeth. Most significantly, Isaiah had begun receiving invitations to Sunday dinners at the Bennett's small home beside the church. At first he declined, wary of fueling gossip, but Elizabeth was persistent, sending notes with local children who rode out to deliver them. Her written words echoed what she'd signed that day in the schoolhouse. Being seen was a gift they could give each other. After the third invitation, Isaiah finally accepted. These Sunday meals became the first genuine friendship he'd known in Redemption Creek. Elizabeth taught him basic signs, Thomas discussed books and ideas, and for a few hours each week, Isaiah allowed himself to forget the careful walls he'd built around his life. But beneath this peaceful surface, dangerous currents were stirring. Sullivan and his followers hadn't forgotten their humiliation. They watched, they waited, and they whispered. Rumors began to spread about Thomas's radical sermons on equality, about Elizabeth's unnatural influence over the town's children, and most dangerously, about Isaiah's growing friendship with the preacher's wife. The whispers reached Isaiah's ears through Harold Walker, who rode out to his ranch one bitter December evening. "Freeman," Walker said grimly as they stood in Isaiah's barn, "you need to watch yourself. Sullivan's been drinking heavy and talking loose about you and the preacher's wife." Isaiah continued, brushing down his horse. "Folks always talk." "Not like this," Walker lowered his voice. "He's saying there's something improper between you two, that you're too familiar with her. that the preacher is too weak to see what's happening under his nose. Isaiah's hand stilled. That's a dangerous lie. It is, Walker agreed, and most folks with sense know it. But Sullivan's got the ear of some of the rougher elements, men who look for excuses. He paused. There's talk of the Night Riders. Isaiah's blood ran cold. The Night Riders were vigilantes who'd been active in the county years before, targeting those they deemed undesirable. They'd largely disbanded after the sheriff in the neighboring county had arrested several members, but the threat of their return had always lingered. I appreciate the warning, Isaiah said quietly. Walker nodded. Just thought you should know. Maybe stay clear of town for a while. Clear of the Bennetts too till this blows over. After Walker left, Isaiah stood in his doorway, watching the snow fall in the lantern light, weighing his options. The sensible choice was clear: distance himself from the Bennetts, return to the isolation that had kept him safe for a decade. But Elizabeth's words echoed in his mind. I didn't come to Redemption Creek to make safe choices. Neither had he once upon a time. He'd come to build something of his own, to live with dignity despite those who would deny it to him. The next morning, Isaiah rode into town with a purpose. He needed to warn Thomas and Elizabeth about the rumors. As he approached the church, he saw Thomas outside splitting firewood. The young preacher looked up in surprise. Isaiah, wasn't expecting you till Sunday. Need to talk, Isaiah said, dismounting. Somewhere private. Thomas's expression grew serious. He led Isaiah into the church, empty on the weekday morning. Inside, Isaiah explained what Walker had told him. Thomas's face darkened with each word. This is absurd, he said when Isaiah finished. You're a friend to both of us. There's nothing improper whatsoever. Truth doesn't matter much to men like Sullivan, Isaiah replied. They see what they want to see, create what they need to justify their hate. Thomas ran a hand through his hair. What should we do? I should stay away, Isaiah said bluntly. From both of you, at least until this dies down. Thomas was shaking his head before Isaiah finished. No, that's letting them win. That's... The church door opened, and Elizabeth entered, her cheeks flushed from the cold. She smiled brightly at Isaiah, signing a greeting he now recognized. Thomas hesitated, torn between protecting his wife and being honest with her. Elizabeth, perceptive as always, noticed the tension immediately. She looked between them, her expression questioning. It's nothing, Thomas began, but Elizabeth's eyes narrowed. She signed rapidly. She says we're terrible liars, Thomas translated reluctantly. She wants to know what's wrong. Isaiah sighed. Elizabeth deserved to know the danger brewing around them. He nodded to Thomas, giving permission to explain. As Thomas signed the situation to Elizabeth, Isaiah watched her face change. Shock, then anger, then a steely determination he'd come to recognize. When Thomas finished, she immediately began signing back, her movements sharp and decisive. She says, Thomas translated, his voice tinged with both pride and worry, that she's faced rumors and ugly whispers her entire life, that retreating only confirms people's worst assumptions, that true friends stand together. She signed again, looking directly at Isaiah. She says you taught her that the day of our wedding, when you didn't stay away, even though it would have been safer. Isaiah removed his hat, turning it in his hands. This is different, Mrs. Bennett. Sullivan's talking about the Night Riders, men who hide behind masks and carry ropes. Elizabeth's expression didn't waver. She signed again, and Thomas's voice grew quiet as he translated. She says her father was killed by Night Riders in Massachusetts for teaching black children to read. She knows exactly what such men are capable of. That's why she refuses to let them dictate how she lives her life or chooses her friends. The revelation stunned Isaiah. He'd never known this part of Elizabeth's history, never guessed at the deeper currents of her courage. All the more reason for caution, he said finally. Elizabeth shook her head firmly and signed again. She says, Thomas translated, that Sunday dinner will be at 4 o'clock as usual. She's making apple pie, and she expects you to be there, Mr. Freeman. Her green eyes held a challenge that Isaiah couldn't refuse. He nodded once, and she smiled in satisfaction before signing that she needed to return to her students. After she left, Thomas turned to Isaiah. "I've never told her this, but you remind me of her father, not in appearance but in spirit. He stood his ground too. Even when it cost him everything." Isaiah put his hat back on. "Let's hope it doesn't come to that." The following days passed without incident, but Isaiah felt the change in town. Conversations stopped when he entered the general store. Men watched him from the saloon doorway as he passed. Even those who had begun to acknowledge him now averted their eyes. Despite the growing tension, Isaiah arrived at the Bennetts' home promptly at 4 that Sunday. Elizabeth greeted him with her usual warmth, but he noticed Thomas had positioned himself where he could watch the street through the window. They were midway through dinner when the first rock shattered the front window. Thomas leapt to his feet as glass sprayed across the floor. Isaiah was already moving, pulling Elizabeth away from the window. Outside, voices shouted obscenities and threats. "Get away from the windows," Isaiah ordered, blowing out the oil lamp to darken the room. The second rock crashed through another pane, followed by a flaming torch that landed on the rug. Thomas stamped it out quickly, but the message was clear. Elizabeth, far from cowering, moved purposefully to a drawer and pulled out a revolver, which she handed to her husband. She then took Isaiah's arm and led them both toward the back door. "Where are we going?" Isaiah asked as Thomas joined them. Elizabeth pointed firmly toward the church. Thomas nodded. "The bell tower. We can see them from there, and it's more defensible." They slipped out the back door and crossed the small yard to the church's side entrance. Inside, they moved quietly through the darkened building to the narrow stairs leading to the bell tower. From this vantage point, they could see a group of about a dozen men in the street. Most were obviously drunk, emboldened by liquor and the anonymity of nightfall. Sullivan's voice carried clearly as he whipped them into a frenzy. "We know you're in there with her, Freeman. Come out and face what's coming to you." Thomas's hand tightened on the revolver. "We need to get the sheriff." "Sheriff's probably turning a blind eye," Isaiah said grimly. "Or worse, he might be down there with them." Elizabeth tugged at Thomas's sleeve and signed rapidly. "She says we need to expose them," Thomas translated. "Bring them into the light. Make the town see what they're really doing." "How?" Isaiah asked. Elizabeth pointed to the church bell, then made a sweeping gesture toward the town. "Ring the bell," Thomas realized. "Wake the whole town. Force everyone to witness this." Isaiah considered it. A mob like this drew courage from shadows and secrecy. If the respectable citizens of Redemption Creek were forced to confront what was happening in their name, at least some might stand against it. "Do it," he told Thomas. Thomas handed the revolver to Isaiah and grabbed the bell rope. The first peal rang out over the town, startling the mob below. Then another and another, the rhythmic tolling of emergency, calling all citizens from their beds. Below, confusion spread through the mob. This wasn't how their night of terror was supposed to proceed. Some began to drift away, unwilling to be identified when the townspeople arrived. Sullivan shouted over the bell, trying to rally his followers, but it was too late. Lights were appearing in windows throughout town. People emerged from homes, moving toward the church in confusion and alarm. Within minutes, the street was filled with citizens in hastily donned coats, staring in shock at the broken windows of the parsonage and the remnants of the mob, now reduced to Sullivan and his most loyal followers. Mayor Thornton pushed through the crowd. "What is the meaning of this? Sullivan, explain yourself." Sullivan, still drunk and enraged, pointed toward the church. "It's the preacher's wife, carrying on with that black rancher right under our noses. We're defending the honor of this town." A murmur ran through the crowd. Some looked uncertain, others outraged, not at the accusation, but at Sullivan. Mr. Williams stepped forward. "My daughter is in Mrs. Bennett's class. Are you accusing her teacher, the woman who's done more for Sally than anyone since her mother died, of such behavior? Based on what evidence?" Sullivan faltered. "Everyone knows what?" Mrs. Williams joined her husband. "That Mrs. Bennett is devoted to her husband? That Mr. Freeman has shown nothing but respect to everyone in this town, despite how he's been treated? That you've been drinking and spreading vicious lies? Thomas emerged from the church, followed by Elizabeth and Isaiah. A hush fell over the crowd. "Neighbors," Thomas called, his voice carrying in the cold night air. "Tonight, Mr. Sullivan and his friends attacked our home. They threw rocks through our windows. They threw a flaming torch into our living room. They threatened violence against my wife and our friend, Mr. Freeman." He paused, looking at the assembled townspeople. "Is this what Redemption Creek stands for? Violence in the night, hatred disguised as moral outrage? If so, then perhaps we've misunderstood the meaning of redemption." Sullivan pointed accusingly. "Look at them standing together. If there's nothing going on, why is he at their house at night?" "Because it's Sunday," Isaiah said quietly, his deep voice somehow carrying through the murmurs of the crowd. "And for the past month, I've been invited to Sunday dinner with the Bennetts, nothing more, nothing less." Elizabeth stepped forward and began to sign, her movements deliberate so everyone could see. Thomas translated. "My wife says that when she first came to Redemption Creek, many of you wondered how a deaf woman could teach your children. You feared what you didn't understand, but you gave her a chance to show you. Now she asks, will you give friendship between people of different colors the same chance? Or is that fear too deeply rooted to overcome?" Her words hung in the cold air. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, surprisingly, old Mrs. Thornton stepped forward. "I've lived in this town for 70 years, she said, her voice quavering but determined. "I've seen hatred destroy good people. I've seen fear turn neighbors against each other." She turned to Sullivan. "And I've seen drunk fools use God's name to justify their own meanness." She then turned to Elizabeth and signed slowly, awkwardly, clearly one of the basic phrases Elizabeth had taught the town. "Thank you." Elizabeth's eyes widened in surprise. She signed back, and Mrs. Thornton nodded with satisfaction. Mayor Thornton cleared his throat. "Sullivan, you and your friends need to go home now. We'll discuss this incident and appropriate consequences tomorrow when you're sober." Sullivan looked around, realizing he'd lost his audience. Most of his followers had already melted away into the crowd. "This isn't over," he muttered, but the threat sounded hollow. As Sullivan stumbled away, the mayor approached Isaiah, Thomas, and Elizabeth. "On behalf of the town, I apologize for this disgraceful behavior. We'll make sure your windows are repaired first thing tomorrow, Reverend." Isaiah watched the crowd disperse, some stopping to express support to the Bennetts, others simply leaving with thoughtful expressions. He knew that not everyone's minds had been changed tonight, but something had shifted in Redemption Creek, a small crack in the wall of prejudice that had stood for generations. Elizabeth touched his arm, drawing his attention. She signed, and though Isaiah didn't understand all the words, he understood the gratitude in her eyes. Thomas translated anyway. "She says she was right about you from the first day. You don't just see people, you help others see them too." Isaiah tipped his hat. "Reckon we've all done some seeing tonight, Mrs. Bennett." Spring came early to Redemption Creek. As the snow melted and the first green appeared on the hills, the town found itself changed in ways both subtle and profound. The events of that winter night had forced a reckoning. Sullivan had been stripped of his position on the town council, and finding himself suddenly unwelcome in many establishments, had eventually left for Denver. Others who had participated in the mob faced similar social consequences, not banishment, but the quiet withdrawal of respect and goodwill. For Elizabeth, the incident had paradoxically cemented her place in the community. Her courage, combined with her obvious devotion to both her husband and her students, had won over even her harshest critics. Her sign language classes, initially attended only by children, now included adults eager to communicate with her. Thomas's congregation had grown, his sermons on compassion and understanding falling on increasingly receptive ears. The young preacher had found his voice, speaking with an authority that belied his years. And Isaiah found himself in an unfamiliar position. No longer merely tolerated, he was increasingly sought out for his quiet wisdom and steadfast character. Children who once crossed the street to avoid him now waved greeting. Storekeepers who had served him reluctantly now engaged him in conversation. Most significantly, his friendship with the Bennetts had become an accepted part of town life. Sunday dinners continued, now occasionally including other guests. Harold Walker and his wife, the Williams family, even Mayor and Mrs. Thornton once. On a warm April afternoon, Isaiah rode into town for the Spring Festival, an event he'd always observed from a distance, if at all. This year, Elizabeth had personally invited him, insisting that her students wanted to show him the signs they had learned. The town square was decorated with ribbons and flowers. Tables laden with food lined one side, while a makeshift stage had been erected on the other. Children ran laughing between booths selling handicrafts and sweets. Isaiah felt a moment of hesitation as he tied whiskey to the hitching post. Old habits died hard, and the memory of 10 years of exclusion didn't fade overnight. But before he could reconsider, Sally Williams spotted him and ran over, her formerly shy face alight with excitement. "Mr. Freeman, you came." She began signing rapidly, then remembered he only knew basic signs. "Mrs. Bennet says I should practice speaking too. We're performing a song later, with our hands. Will you watch?" Isaiah smiled at the child's enthusiasm. "Wouldn't miss it, Miss Sally." Throughout the afternoon, Isaiah found himself welcomed into conversations, offered food, even pulled into a horseshoe competition, which he won handily. The strangeness of it never quite left him, this newfound belonging in a place that had so long rejected him. But alongside the strangeness was something he hadn't felt in years: hope. As evening approached, Elizabeth gathered her students on the stage. Thomas stood beside her to translate as she signed to the audience. "Today, my students will share something special with you. They have learned to hear with their hearts and to speak with their hands. This song is dedicated to someone who showed us all that understanding crosses all boundaries, Mr. Isaiah Freeman." Isaiah felt a flush of embarrassment at being singled out, but it was quickly replaced by wonder as the children began to perform. Their small hands moved in perfect unison, creating a visual symphony that needed no translation. Even those in the audience who didn't understand sign language were captivated by the beauty of it. As the performance concluded to enthusiastic applause, Isaiah noticed an unfamiliar carriage pulling into the square. A distinguished older gentleman emerged, assisted by a younger man. Both were well-dressed, clearly visitors from the city. Mayor Thornton hurried to greet them, and after a brief conversation, led them toward the stage where Elizabeth was congratulating her students. Isaiah watched curiously as Elizabeth turned to the visitors. Her expression shifted from polite inquiry to shock, then joy. She began signing rapidly, embracing the older man with tears in her eyes. Thomas approached Isaiah, his face alight with excitement. "That's Elizabeth's uncle, Dr. James Hayward. He's a professor at Gallaudet College, the most prestigious school for the deaf in the country. And the younger man is his assistant, who's also deaf." Isaiah watched as Elizabeth introduced her students to her uncle, her hands flying in animated conversation. What brings them to Redemption Creek? Letters, apparently. Elizabeth has been writing about her work here, the teaching methods she's developed, the way she's integrated signing with regular education. From what Mayor Thornton just told me, Dr. Hayward wants to document her approach. He thinks it could help deaf children across the country. The celebration took on new energy with the arrival of the distinguished visitors. As darkness fell, lanterns were lit around the square and musicians set up for dancing. Isaiah, content after a day unlike any he'd experienced in Redemption Creek, prepared to take his leave when Elizabeth hurried over, bringing her uncle with her. "Mr. Freeman," Thomas said, joining them, "Dr. Hayward has asked specifically to meet you. Elizabeth has written about you in her letters." Isaiah removed his hat respectfully. "It's an honor, Dr. Hayward." The professor shook Isaiah's hand firmly while Elizabeth signed. Thomas translated, "Uncle James says he's heard how you stood by us during difficult times. He says true allies are rare and precious." Dr. Hayward spoke directly, his voice carrying the careful enunciation of someone who had been deaf from birth but had learned to speak. "My niece tells me you've been learning sign language." "Just basic phrases, sir," Isaiah replied. "Mrs. Bennet is a patient teacher." Elizabeth signed something to her uncle, who laughed and signed back. She then turned to Isaiah and signed slowly, "Friend, family, heart." Isaiah recognized these signs and nodded. "Yes, ma'am. Those words I know well." Dr. Hayward studied Isaiah thoughtfully. "Mr. Freeman, My niece believes that what has happened in this town is remarkable. Not just her teaching success, but the transformation of the community. She credits much of that to you." Isaiah shook his head. "Mrs. Bennet gives me too much credit. She and the Reverend changed this town with their courage and kindness." Elizabeth signed again, and Dr. Hayward translated this time. "She says that courage is contagious, Mr. Freeman. You showed it first, and that gave others permission to be brave too." Before Isaiah could respond, Mayor Thornton approached with an announcement. "Dr. Hayward has graciously agreed to address us briefly about his work at Gallaudet College and the importance of education for the deaf." As the crowd gathered around the stage, Isaiah found himself standing beside Mr. Williams and his family. The businessman, once one of the most prejudiced men in town, now nodded respectfully to Isaiah as they listened to Dr. Hayward speak about his lifelong work advocating for deaf education. "The greatest barrier," Dr. Hayward concluded, "is not between those who can hear and those who cannot. It is between those who refuse to understand and those who are never given a chance to be understood. My niece has written to me about how this town overcame that barrier, not just for her but between all people who had been divided by prejudice and fear." His gaze found Isaiah in the crowd. Sometimes it takes just one person willing to see beyond the surface, to listen with the heart rather than the ears. From what I've heard, Redemption Creek is fortunate to have several such people. After the speech, as music began and couples moved to dance, Elizabeth approached Isaiah once more. She signed a question. Thomas, standing nearby, translated, "She's asking if you'll join us for a special dinner tomorrow. Uncle James wants to hear more about your experiences here." Isaiah nodded. "I'd be honored, Mrs. Bennet." Elizabeth signed again, and Thomas smiled as he translated, "She says it's time you called her Elizabeth, as she's asked you to do for months. Friends use first names." Isaiah smiled. "Then I'll see you tomorrow, Elizabeth." As he turned to leave, Elizabeth touched his arm one more time. When he looked back, she placed her hand over her heart, then pointed to her ear, and finally pointed to him. No translation was needed. She hears with her heart. And what she heard in Isaiah was what no one else in Redemption Creek had bothered to listen for: the dignity, courage, and compassion that had always been there, waiting to be recognized. Isaiah rode home under a sky brilliant with stars, his thoughts on how much had changed in the space of a few months. A deaf woman and her husband had come to a small, prejudiced town, and through their simple refusal to be less than who they were, had begun to transform it. And somehow he had been drawn into their orbit, his own life changing in ways he never could have imagined. As his ranch came into view, Isaiah remembered something his father had told him long ago. Change doesn't come from making big speeches or grand gestures. It comes from living your truth so plainly that it becomes impossible for others to deny it. Elizabeth Bennet had lived her truth. Against all odds, in a place that initially rejected her, she had refused to be defined by what she lacked. Instead, she had shown everyone the unique gifts that came from her different way of experiencing the world. And in doing so, she had helped Isaiah reclaim his own truth, not just as a skilled rancher or a man who had built something from nothing, but as someone worthy of friendship, respect, and a place in the community. Redemption Creek had begun to live up to its name. Not through dramatic revelations or sudden conversions, but through the slow, steady work of people learning to truly see each other, to hear not just with their ears, but with their hearts. If this story touched your heart, please hit that subscribe button and join the Black Rancher family. These are the untold stories of America's past that deserve to be remembered and shared. Your support allows us to keep bringing these powerful narratives to light. Thank you for spending this time with us. Remember that true hearing happens not with the ears, but with the heart. A lesson as relevant today as it was in 1883. If you know someone who needs to hear this message, share this video with them. Until next time, this is the Black Rancher, preserving our heritage one story at a time.